Well, last Sunday I was driving back to Portland from Lincoln City, and I decided on a whim to make a little detour. I found myself in the town of Dayton, Oregon, population about 1,500, founded long ago by pioneer settlers, and a very typically Oregon sort of town. Dayton has a central and very beautiful park block, and that area was filled with, it looked like hundreds of people having a community picnic on a beautiful Sunday, and yes, it was a Cinco de Mayo celebration. But this was certainly not a purely Mexican-American party. It was obvious that most of the people there were what we would loosely call Anglos or non-Hispanic Americans. I realized that in Dayton, as in Portland, Cinco de Mayo has become a truly bicultural celebration. And that's what today's club speaker is here to talk about, among other things. Roberto Berry is president of the Portland-Guadalajara Sister City Association, which has staged Portland's Cinco de Mayo festival for the past 8 years. Portland's fiesta is gaining national repute. It's one of Portland's largest annual events, drawing thousands and thousands of visitors this year to a celebration that lasted 4 days in Waterfront Park. Don't look now, but Portland has become a multicultural, multi-ethnic city. And it seems that so far, at least, we can take pride in making a lot more out of this diversity thing in Portland than just about any other American city can. Roberto Berry was born and reared in Mexico City. He's a graduate of the University of California at Santa Cruz with a bachelor's degree in philosophy. His thesis was on Immanuel Kant, I believe. Fascinating. You can tell us a bit about that if you'd like to. He then went on to the law school at the University of California at Davis, graduated from there, clerked for 2 years for Judge Edward Levy of the Ninth Circuit here in Portland, and since 1990, Mr. Berry has been an attorney with the Portland firm of Ader, Wynn, Hewitt, Dodson, and Scarrett, where he concentrates on, among other things, trade law, international, and corporate law. Any lawyer who can author a law review article is doing something, but I have to say Mr. Berry has done us one better. He has published a law review in Spanish and on legal ethics, nonetheless, in a Mexican law journal. Maybe more on that later, too. At any rate, among other things, Mr. Berry has in his quiver of credits membership in the City Club of Portland. So let's welcome one of our own to talk about Portland and the Cinco de Mayo, Roberto Berry.
Thank you very much, Jim. First of all, I want to say that I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much to the City Club for inviting me to speak on Cinco de Mayo. There's a couple of people and entities that I want to thank. I want to thank my law firm, the firm of Ader Wynn, because they have been providing me unbending support throughout the year that I've been president of the Portland-Guadalajara Sister City Association. And without that support, it would have been very difficult for me to even attempt to do the things that I've attempted to do as president of the association. I also want to thank from the bottom of my heart the members of the Portland-Guadalajara Sister City Association, because for me as a Mexican, it is very impressive to come to another country and find people who love Mexico as much as any Mexican does. And it proves to me that people can love people from other countries and from other places, and it just says a lot to me, so I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart. Well, my job is to tell you a little bit about Cinco de Mayo. And I want to tell you that this year's Cinco de Mayo was a special Cinco de Mayo for various reasons. The first is that before our celebrations began in April 30 here in Waterfront Park, on the 22nd of April, Guadalajara was rocked by explosions running along approximately 8.5 miles of its sewer system. These explosions were caused by gasoline leaks into the sewer system and caused approximately 194 deaths, many wounded, and has left approximately 10,000 people homeless. I was in San Diego at the time. I was working on a case and started receiving phone calls about this event. Very early on, I decided it was important for me to come back to Portland. I came back to Portland the day after the explosions. My plane landed at 8:30 p.m. By 9:30 p.m., myself and other members of the association were meeting with representatives from the City of Portland's Environmental Services Division. They told us that from seeing the pictures that they saw on television and from evaluating the information that was coming through the media, that it was their assessment that the situation in Guadalajara was still very crucial and very dangerous. And so they suggested to us that if the Sister City Association would fund a team of people to go down to Guadalajara and take charge of the situation, that they would gladly do so. Well, of course, it's not that easy. We had to call the people in Guadalajara. I called my counterpart, Licenciado Manuel Arteaga. It was already midnight in Guadalajara time. Got him out of bed, said to him, hey, listen, we have a Portland team of specialists that perhaps could be of use in Guadalajara. Do you want them? He asked me to wait. He called me back in 5 minutes. He had called the Director of Public Works for the city of Guadalajara, who said, yes, we do want them desperately. To make a long story short, in half a day, we had composed a team that included engineers and people that specialized in sewer systems and in toxic gases. We got them together, we put them on a plane, we sent them down to Guadalajara in a 2 p.m. flight on the very next day. Delta very kindly allowed us to send whatever equipment was necessary at no charge. Anyway, that team went down there, and I want to tell you that as the city of Portland, you should be very proud of what they did. Other cities and other states in this country sent teams down to Guadalajara. LA, Houston, and Alabama sent teams, but our team was the only team that had engineers that specialized in sewer systems. They arrived at Guadalajara at 9 p.m. and immediately began to work with public city officials, and they began to have daily meetings with the governor. Well, our team very quickly distinguished itself for being the most competent of all the teams in Guadalajara. And after 2 meetings with the governor gave instructions that all the teams, foreign and national, were going to defer to the instructions of the Portland team. Now, that says a great deal about the quality of the people that went down to Guadalajara. They were there in Guadalajara. They did a wonderful job. They improvised equipment when they didn't have the equipment that they needed. They undoubtedly saved many lives. The president of Mexico asked for them to be flown from Guadalajara to Mexico City so that he could personally shake their hands and say thank you. And believe me, meeting the president of Mexico is not easy. And so off they went, and I'm just so delighted that our Portland team did so much in Guadalajara. And I want to thank them, and I frankly think that we should all applaud their efforts. Okay, the Cinco de Mayo this year was also significant for another reason, a more domestic reason, and that is our event began on April 20 and was going to run till May the 3rd. Well, you know very well what happened on April 30th. On April 30th, the news of the Rodney King verdict spread around the country, and we started having violent demonstrations in all of the cities of this country. Here we were with an event in Waterfront Park that draws approximately 100,000 people over a span of 4 days. We could have anywhere from 15 to 25,000 people in any given day at the park, and at any given moment at the park we could have anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 people. We were very, very concerned that the violence that was seen in other cities of the country would spread to Portland and specifically would completely damage the event. Well, I can tell you, now feeling 1,000 pounds lighter today, that we did not have one single violent incident that went beyond the ordinary at the park. I was just so amazed by that. And credit goes to two entities. The first is the city police. They did a wonderful job. They did not come to the event. That would have been counterproductive because people would have been scared to come to the event. Instead, they took key positions along the city and made sure that no disturbance ever reached the event. They did an excellent job. There was a time when we were in constant communication with them, giving them hourly reports of what was happening at the site, and there was nothing to report because everything was just fine, and that was an amazing thing. But the fact is that the Portland police did an outstanding job. The second factor is really one that is, to me, very impressive. Every day that we had the event, I introduced the ballet folklorica from the city of Guadalajara, and I would walk up to the stage, and usually the stage was completely packed of people that had come to see the ballet. And I would say a few introductory remarks about the nature of the ballet, the nature of the dances that people would see, and so on and so forth. And I would have a chance to see the faces of the people that had congregated to watch the ballet dance. And I can tell you, I saw faces of every color, every creed, every national origin, every sex, well, there's only two, but every age. And all of these people were sitting down there, arm to arm, very close to one another. We must have had, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people at the tent in one time, all very close to one another. And all of these people were sitting there peacefully, attentive, paying respect to the dancers that they were going to see. I was just so impressed by the citizens of Portland. I was just amazed that the cities of the rest of the country were having such problem, and here we were in Waterfront Park in Portland, Oregon, and we had a diversity that is enviable, and there was just peace and happiness. I was just amazed, and I think it says a lot about the quality of the citizens of Portland, and my heart goes out to them. Well, those are the two factors that made this year's 1992 Cinco de Mayo event significant to me personally. But of course, you're here to learn a little bit about Cinco de Mayo in general as well. I can bet that many of you think that Cinco de Mayo is the anniversary of the Mexican independence, the equivalent of the American 4th of July. Well, that is not the case. Of course, if I were you, I'd probably think the same thing, because if you go down to Waterfront Park, what do you see? You see all kinds of fun events. You see dancers, you eat snow cones, you have all kinds of foods. Well, that looks like a very festive occasion, and it looks like a 4th of July. It certainly walks and talks like one. Well, that's a good guess. Well, it turns out to be the incorrect guess. The Cinco de Mayo is the commemoration of the Battle of Puebla in Mexico. And in Mexico, the celebration of the Cinco de Mayo is very different in nature from the one that you see here. We do have the same sort of celebration that you see in Portland Cinco de Mayo on the 16th of September in Mexico. That's the day when Mexicans celebrate Independence Day, and it is the same sort of festive occasion that you see here in Waterfront Park on the Cinco de Mayo. But in Mexico, the Cinco de Mayo itself is a different sort of a celebration, and I'll give you some background of the history of the Cinco de Mayo so that you can understand what the celebration is like and why it is the way it is. Cinco de Mayo celebrates the Battle of Puebla that took place in 1862. In the 1840s, Mexico was a country in complete disarray. Mexico had lost over half of its territory to the United States. Just imagine what it means for a country to lose half of the territory. The fact is that the country was completely demoralized. There was talk of whether the country would just simply become another annex to the United States, or whether it would splinter off into smaller countries. Well, in fact, the country survived. Of course, you all know that. But there was a time when it was touch and go. Towards the end of the 1840s and the 1850s, two groups came out of the rubble and sort of started building a national life again. One group was the group of the so-called conservatives. This is a term of art that you will see in every book of Mexican history. The conservatives were the perennial ruling class. They had been ruling Mexico since Spain came to Mexico and instituted its government. They had vast land holdings, vast wealth. They were just a set of families that basically controlled most of the governmental power in Mexico. Well, they also had very tight connections with the church. The Catholic Church in Mexico in the time of the colony owned approximately 75% of the land in Mexico, directly and indirectly. And where it owned it indirectly, it was probably through the conservatives. So their connection with the church was very, very tight. Across the table from the conservatives were, of course, the liberals. And the liberals were the intellectuals of a growing middle class that had the capacity to run the government, but were always precluded from being in government by the conservatives. And so they were basically a set of intellectuals that were somewhat discontented with the regime and were always pushing for reform. The liberals did see what the conservatives did not see, and that was that the vast majority of Mexico, the masses of Mexico, were lacking in education, in essential services, and there was an urgent need for reform. So the liberals had that sort of vision that the conservatives did not. The 1850s saw the tide turn in favor of the liberals. That in 1857, Mexico was able to come up with its most important constitution, and it's called a liberal constitution. Its founder is Benito Juárez, who became the president of Mexico, as one of the Mexican history's most important figures. And I'll just give you an idea of the document by relating you two provisions of the document. One completely destroyed the landholding system whereby the church was able to own most of the land in Mexico for many years. Basically, they worked under a complex amortization scheme, and this constitution did away with that scheme and forced the church to sell whatever land it could not pay on the spot. It also took away the judicial jurisdiction from the church to rule over civil and criminal matters. So as you can see from these two provisions of this 1857 Constitution, somebody was not going to be pleased, and that was going to be the conservatives and the church. They were certainly not pleased. Following that Constitution, what began to happen was that there were uprisings all throughout Mexico, basically instigated by the conservatives. The conservatives named the president, so Mexico at this time had two presidents, Benito Juárez, the liberal president, and General Miramón, who was the conservative president. And of course, the conservative president had all these ties with Europe. He was able to secure financing for his wars against the liberals by getting loans from Spain and England and France. And these loans are crucial because they set the stage for the later intervention of France into Mexico. Well, the war started happening. It took 3 years, but it became pretty clear that the liberals were going to win it. When it became clear, the European countries that had lent money to finance the war started thinking, well, either we are paid what we lent, or we better have a say in how this government of Mexico is going to structure itself so that we can protect our European interests in Mexico. With this in mind, people started talking about sending troops into Mexico. Napoleon got into the act, and not only did he send troops to Mexico along with Spain and England, but he also started talking to some of the Mexicans in Europe about the possibility of instituting a monarchy in Mexico with a European emperor. Well, Spain, England, and France, as I was mentioning, sent troops to Mexico to demand payment for the debts that the conservative president had incurred, and they landed in the port of Veracruz in late 1961. Well, the Mexican government, of course, was completely broke. There was no chance the Mexican government could pay the debts that were demanded of them. And somehow it was able to pacify the government of Spain and the government of England, not so the government of France. The French were the most aggressive, and Napoleon's troops penetrated into the Mexican territory. They advanced towards Puebla in the early days of 1862. Puebla is a city close to Mexico City. In the times of the colony and in the 1800s, it was a very important city. The troops of Napoleon arrived to Puebla to fight a battle against largely improvised forces under the Mexican general Ignacio Zaragoza. What Ignacio Zaragoza did was that he just got together a bunch of peasants and armed them and prepared them for a fight in a few days to come. He really was not in command of an organized army. Well, somehow, miraculously, this small band of armed peasants were able to defeat the troops of Napoleon to this day, we don't know how it happened, but it happened. Well, the Cinco de Mayo is the date on which the Mexican troops defeated the French troops, and that's why we celebrate the Cinco de Mayo today. But before you can think that, gosh, this battle was the battle and Mexicans were able to kick the French out, I want to tell you that that's not what happened, because this was only a battle. It was not the war. The French continued their fighting in Mexico, eventually did manage to take Puebla, and did eventually manage to institute a monarchy, that of Maximilian of the Habsburgs. So the French stayed in Mexico. The Mexican troops never really were able to kick out the French troops. The French troops basically got sick of being in Mexico. Napoleon decided that they were needed at home, took the troops back, and Maximilian was the emperor at the time. He was not a very effective leader at all. He was never able to make Mexico produce, and so he was basically financing his emperorship through further loans from Europe. So finally, Europe got tired of financing him. Napoleon withdrew his troops, and the monarchy fell under its own weight, and Maximilian was eliminated from the picture. He was shot, actually. Okay, well, anyways, that's the history behind Cinco de Mayo, and so you can see that Cinco de Mayo is not really the independence of Mexico, and in Mexico, we don't celebrate the Cinco de Mayo like we celebrate it here. Cinco de Mayo the celebrations of Cinco de Mayo in Mexico are best known by the young men in Mexico, not the young women in Mexico, because men in Mexico have to serve 1 year and they have to do a military service for 1 year. That doesn't mean that they go to a camp and they do all this work for 1 year. No, it just means that for 1 year they do a series of chores for the military at least once a week. Well, the end of the military service year is the Cinco de Mayo, and on Cinco de Mayo there's a big parade. It's a military parade. And the rule is that if you've done your service the full year, but if you miss the Cinco de Mayo celebration, you have to repeat the year. So if you're a young man doing the military service, you know when that Cinco de Mayo is coming around, and you know that you're going to be present at that celebration. So that's what it is. In Mexico, more than anything else, it's a celebration of the armed forces. What you will see is the military making parades. It is not the same sort of celebration that we have here in the Cinco de Mayo. Well, why the difference? I find, as a person that came from Mexico, I find the difference intriguing and absolutely fascinating. First of all, I want to make it clear that I think that the Cinco de Mayo celebration here in Portland, Oregon, and all the other cities of the U.S. is absolutely great. It's fantastic. It gives the opportunity to Mexicans and Mexican Americans to display their culture to the society at large, and I think that's a wonderful thing. We make very, very great efforts to bring the ballet folklorico from the city of Guadalajara and their mariachi so that people could see here something that is typically and authentically Mexican. We want Mexican Americans to come to that event and enjoy their roots and see something that reminds them of their home country way back when. And we also want everybody to enjoy and learn a little bit about Mexico. So I think that the Cinco de Mayo is a wonderful way of doing it. In fact, I wouldn't care if it was the 22nd of February, as long as there was at least one day where Mexicans and Mexican Americans could display their culture to society at large. And so I think that the event is wonderful. Nevertheless, the difference between the celebration of the Cinco de Mayo in Mexico and the celebration of the Cinco de Mayo here is intriguing. I mean, somebody along the lines had a cultural, historical confusion. Hey, this is not independence, okay? But this I think is very interesting because it tracks the development of a truly Mexican-American culture as opposed to a Mexican culture. If they were truly, completely, 100% Mexican, well, Cinco de Mayo would not be celebrated the way it is celebrated. But the fact is that Mexican Americans in this country are no longer completely Mexicans. And you would be surprised how many Mexican intellectuals write essays and books and poems trying to understand the experience of Mexican Americans in this country. And all that these poems and books and essays reflect is their impressions of what it would be for a Mexican to live in the United States. Well, folks, that's not it. It's not Mexicans living in the United States, it's Mexican Americans living in the United States. I was at a conference once in Los Angeles where one Hispanic leader got up and said, I don't know what Mexicans think about us, but the fact is that even though we're Catholic, we're getting to be kind of Protestant. So the fact is that Mexican Americans have developed their own identity and they have become a part of this society, and I think that is a wonderful thing. And my last reflection on that I will leave to you is that even though they're Mexican Americans, they're still not completely, they still have not forgotten their Mexican roots, and that is a wonderful thing, because one of the traits that Mexican Americans will bring to this society and have brought and will continue to bring, I think, is a strong sense of a family unit. Now you go to the beach this summer, and you go to the Oregon coast somewhere, and you look at the Mexican Americans that are enjoying themselves at the beach. Will you see a Mexican American couple? No. You will see the Mexican American husband, the wife, the grandmother, the grandfather, the uncle, the aunt, the kids. You will see a tremendous amount of people. And why is that? That's because Mexicans are very tight in their families, and Mexican Americans have kept that trait, and I hope they will continue to keep that trait. I think that it would not be an exaggeration to say that in Mexico, the family is more important than the government and than work, easily. If something happens in your family, you leave work. Even if you're the president of Mexico, you leave work and you go and see what's happening in your family. That is, how important it is. And you are City Club people, and you have been discussing many of the social problems that we have in this society, and I'm sure you know that many of those problems derive from the fact that in the American culture we have been suffering from a continued erosion of the nuclear family. I think that the Mexican Americans that live in this country have a wonderful contribution to make in terms of their families, of this family culture. And I just hope that we are able to transmit that in events like Cinco de Mayo, which we want to be a family event, and which we, I think, have succeeded in making a family event. And I hope that that becomes a constructive part of the Mexican American contribution to this culture. And with that, I leave you and I'm open to your questions.
Well, I've learned a lot. I suspect most of us have. Thank you, Roberto. Chuck Williams, board host, first question.
Thank you, Jim. Excellent talk. Before the meeting, I thought I would ask a question about the North American Free Trade Agreement, but after hearing your talk, I think I'll leave that topic for another discussion. I'm much more interested in your comments about what you think Mexicans think of Americans. What is the feeling in your trips back to Mexico City about relationships between the two countries, especially on a personal level? Are they getting better? Are they staying same? Are they worsening? Depending on the behavior of the United States, both culturally and economically, things getting better, worse, and what can we do to make relationships better?
Thank you. That's a very broad topic indeed. But I'll tell you this, on a personal level, Mexicans have never had a problem with Americans. You see there the board of the Portland-Guadalajara Sister City Association. They've been going down to Guadalajara for years. Personally, there's never been a problem. On a social level, on a grander level, there have been some frictions in the past. You say that you did not want to ask about the North American Free Trade Agreement. The fact is that the way that Mexico feels now is linked to the way that the North American Free Trade Agreement has. The sentiment is that through this agreement we will be much closer to one another. I think Mexicans, as a rule, really have not had a problem with the United States. The government has had its problems with the United States, but not the people of Mexico. And I think that all Mexicans are very expectant now that this North American Free Trade Agreement will improve our relations, both commercial and personal, and everybody in Mexico is tremendously excited about this agreement. Here in the United States, you will read about the agreement in the paper every so often. In Mexico, you read about the agreement every day. It's on the front page of every newspaper every day. So, just to give you an idea.
I'm Beth Howell, member of the Arts and Culture Standing Committee. Mr. Berry, our state, Oregon, has a growing Hispanic population, and I'm wondering what issues and concerns you'd like to see Oregon address regarding our own Hispanic people and culture.
Well, I myself would very much like to see more Hispanic people in downtown Portland. I don't see that many. Most of the Hispanic people that I see are in the neighboring areas, and they're doing the sort of work that is transitional work, field work. I certainly hope that with a little bit of time we can draw that population into other types of areas, so that there's a representation of Hispanics in all sectors. I was just reading an article today that there's only one state Supreme Court judge in the country that is Hispanic, only one. So I think we've got a long ways to go as a state and as a country, and I just hope that that happens as soon as possible.
I'm Mary McCarthy. You mentioned the tragedy in Guadalajara, and you also talked about the free trade agreement. In your opinion, how do you think that the current negotiations between the U.S. and Mexico will be affected by the lack of environmental controls in Mexico and the issues of pollution and other environmental issues?
Well, it is a very big issue in the negotiations. I think it is one of the major stumbling blocks. Of course, environmental groups in the United States have been lobbying very hard to have the Free Trade Agreement include a specific chapter on environmental protection. That has not come about. Nevertheless, the U.S. administration and the Mexican administration have made assurances to the fact that they will have their environmental agencies cooperate with one another and ensure environmental compliance. Mexico is moving very quickly to adapt its laws to mirror the U.S. laws, and basically they know that they're going to profit from the experience of the environmental laws in the United States. So they're very quickly trying to mirror them in Mexican law. And the key issue is going to be developing the enforcement mechanisms that you have in this country, in Mexico. Now, the explosions in Guadalajara were very, very timely, because the explosions make the point that if Mexico is going to develop along the industrial lines of the first world, it's going to have to pay attention to its environment. And I think that the Mexican administration is very much aware that that is what it's going to have to do. And I see every willingness on the part of the Mexican government to do that. President Salinas was absolutely furious that the explosions occurred in Guadalajara. He has now decreed that every big city in Mexico is going to have to develop programs to monitor gasolines. Certainly Pemex, the state-owned oil system, is going to have to also have specific programs devoted to safety. It is of the prime importance in the national agenda in Mexico to develop environmental protection. Yeah.
Leslie Hildula. It's my perception that there's a lot of problem with free elections in Mexico, and that the PRI is not willing to allow many open elections. That's just my perception. And so it worries me that perhaps we won't have a lot of stability in Mexico. And then I think about how that impacts things like free trade agreements until that problem is somehow corrected. And I would be curious about your opinion on that.
Well, Mexico has had a history of problems with elections, as you say. They have not been very open, and I think that every government official is willing to concede that. But that has been changing. In the past elections, the government has truly made an effort to modernize the system. I have to tell you that the government in Mexico is run by the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which is the main party. The party has been in power for 60 years. The party's main concern is to make sure that Mexico is a stable country. So in terms of stability, I don't think you have to worry about it, because Mexico is very stable indeed. In terms of free elections, the government has been moving and trying very hard to get rid of the dinosaurs that live in the party caves, and modernize the system. I do think that elections now in Mexico are as free as they have ever been in Mexico. It's a significant improvement from the past, and I think that at least President Salinas is very aware of the problem. I personally think Salinas is a genius, but partly because the whole idea of the North American Free Trade Agreement is his own project in Mexico. And he is doing that, I think, partly to ensure that there's a certain continuity of a political system and a political agenda from administration to administration. In Mexico, you usually had one president, and he said, well, this wall is white, and then for 6 years the wall was white. Get the next president, and he says, well, this wall is red, and then for 6 years the wall was red. Well, I think Salinas is making this North America Free Trade Agreement so big a project and so international a project that future presidents won't be able to touch it. And so I think that the North American Free Trade Agreement is a brilliant way of guaranteeing the stability of Mexico, because future presidents are not going to be able to come in and say, I don't like this free trade agreement, let's get rid of it. They're not going to be able to. So I think that the agreement will guarantee stability, and so that's my response.
I'm Will Reed, City Club member. I'm curious about your comments about the Mexican-American and Mexican family. A couple of the explanations of why the American family is doing what it's doing is there's a decreased importance of the church, especially with the dogma about divorce, and there's an increase or a change in definitions of gender roles. Women are having more power, and that's one reason the family is changing in America. Do you see that happening with Hispanic American families, with Mexican American families? Are they changing, and do you see that happening in Mexico as far as less reliance on the church for guidelines and increasing changing power of women?
Yeah. Well, I think that the role of the church in Mexico continues to be a very important role, and in fact it's on the up and up vis-a-vis government pronouncements, because the current administration of Salinas has made an overture to the church, usually since the time of the reforms of the 1857 Constitution. There's always been this tremendous fighting between church and state. And Salinas has tried to bridge that, so actually the church is on the up and up in Mexico. I think that religion is a part of most Mexicans, and most specifically the Catholic religion is a part of the life of most Mexicans, and continues to be that way here. I myself go to the Mexican or the Spanish Mass in St. Patrick's, because that's the only Mass where I feel comfortable, because Spanish is spoken anyway. I think that continues to be important in the Mexican-American community. I certainly see a lot of Mexican-Americans there, and it will continue to be a force. Now, as to the role of women, women in Mexico are very powerful people. Their professional role is changing. The professional role in Mexico has been moving towards the American model, that is to say, there's absolutely no distinction in the workplace between men and women. And while it's not quite at the same level as it is here, it is moving in that direction. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that women are powerless in Mexico, because they're very powerful people. Women exercise power in ways that men, often find themselves not knowing how or why they're doing the things that they're doing, and it's basically because the women are controlling everything. So anyway. I mean, I don't know. People always say, oh, but in Mexico it's so chauvinistic. Well, I don't know. It's hard for me to feel it because personally I know that, for example, my mother and my sister are the pivots of my family, and family is so important that I know that when my mother says something has to happen, we'll all bend over backwards to make sure that it happens. And then when it doesn't happen, all hell breaks loose. So anyway, I do think that those roles are carrying over to the Mexican-American community, although I do think the Mexican-American community obviously is much more close to the American model of absolutely no distinction. And I do see that. I see many Hispanic women now in positions that would be absolutely what would traditionally have been male positions. So, yeah, sure.
Bob Wheel, member. A former high-ranking government official told me that we've lost complete control of our borders. I wonder if you discuss the subject of immigration.
Well, sure. I don't know why there's this paranoia about borders. The fact is that Mexicans have been coming to the United States ever since the borders were created. It's been more like a permeable membrane than anything else. The issue of immigration being a problem is a political issue. It's not an issue of people, because people have been crossing that border and coming here to work in those fields ever since the border was established. There are complex problems of immigration, obviously, because of the nature of the beast. The United States is very concerned about controlling its borders. It's very concerned about illegal immigration. I don't think that there has been that much of a change, frankly, in the amounts of people that cross the border illegally, and nor do I think that laws are really gonna do it, because people need to eat and feed their families, and people here need somebody to work the fields, and that's just going to translate into people crossing that border. So I suppose if you try to control everything, you have a control problem. If you're not trying to control everything, you don't have that much of a problem. That's my personal view.
Ted Kay, City Club member. I'm intrigued by the sistership between Portland and Guadalajara, Guadalajara being the second largest city in Mexico, and Portland is not the second largest city in the United States. Guadalajara is not a maritime city. It's on a lake, not a river. Different places in the geography of their respective countries. Could you explain a little bit about the background of the relationship between Portland and Guadalajara and how the sister city relationship took place?
Well, actually, the founder of the sister city relationship is sitting right here. He's watching this set of questions, very amused, I'm sure. The sister city program currently has criteria for sister cities that say that the sister city has to be of the approximate same size and have similar demographic characteristics and so on and so forth. The effort is made now to have sister cities be truly mirrors of one another. When the Portland-Guadalajara Sister City Association was established, there was no such set of criteria, although obviously the concept of similar cities has always existed. Now, I think that the sister city relationship with Guadalajara in particular was accomplished because there were certain people who just basically loved Guadalajara. As you know, Guadalajara is the site for many retired American folk. They go down to live in Guadalajara. And in fact, most American people will know about Guadalajara as opposed to, let's say, Oaxaca or Michoacán or any other state or city. So Guadalajara has this visibility that draws people, and certainly the founders of the sister city relationship knew Guadalajara, knew it quite well, and fell in love with it. And people from Guadalajara have actually come to Portland. We've had in fact, my counterpart in Guadalajara, Manuel Arteaga, studied in Portland. And so there's all this communication between the movers, so to say. So that's why this relationship was established. And it's been a very fruitful relationship. The fact that the cities are not really completely similar to one another, has not placed a barrier between the way we communicate with one another. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto Berry. We enjoyed having you with us. Thanks to you and the people in the Portland-Guadalajara Sister City Association. We're obviously having a very good relationship with our sister city, and let's hope that relations with Mexico generally will prosper in years to come, too. And with exchanges of citizens such as you, I think we'll certainly do very well. Thank you again, Roberto. We are adjourned.